Okay, well, a very good evening to you all. My name is Tony Travers from the Institute of Public Affairs here at the LSE in the Government Department. I'm here to chair this evening to facilitate the discussion that will follow on this most topical of subjects. I'd wise open the importance of a smooth transition to a new EU deal. And I'll say just a little bit more of that myself by way of introduction in a moment. The Twitter hashtag is hashtag LSE Brexit, and you can see it there at the bottom of the screen. And what I want to do first is just say a few words about our two guests, and then very briefly by way of introduction, a few words about the subject before disappearing down into the audience. So we have two speakers this evening who can then get going with their presentation. And the two speakers are Carolyn Fairbairn, who is the Director General of the CBI, and Rain Newton-Smith, who is the CBI's Chief Economist. And I'll just say a little word about each of them first before introducing the topic. Carolyn is Director General, as I said, of the CBI. She began her career as an economist at the World Bank, then went on to work at The Economist magazine, has worked at McKinsey, has had a range of roles in the private sector, spanning manufacturing skills in the banking sector, became BBC's Director of Strategy, where I first met Carolyn some years ago now, and subsequent to that, was Director of Group Development and Strategy at ITV. I think it's fair to say few people in public life have as wide a view of both public and private sectors. Rain Newton-Smith is the Chief Economist at the CBI, was previously Head of Emerging Markets at Oxford Economics, and before that had a distinguished career, 9 years at the Bank of England and part of the time at the IMF. So two people who will, in a sense, be able to tell us more about what business now feels it needs from the process of the Brexit negotiations. Hard to think of any two better. Just a couple of words from me before we get going. We're now a year and 2 weeks on from the EU referendum, which occurred on the 23rd of June last year. And in the intervening period, I think it's fair to say, against some expectations, the economy has continued to grow, but now looking ahead appears to be growing slightly less strongly, and with the suggestion that there might be more of a downturn. And of course, with the uncertainties surrounding Brexit now potentially undermining consumer confidence and investment. And I think the problem that business has, and all of us have, is that the nature of the government's negotiating position is such that it's hard to be certain whether the government has a fully worked through plan that they don't want to fully reveal because it's part of a dealing process, negotiating process, or alternatively doesn't have a fully worked through plan, but we don't know that anyway. And trying to work out which of those two it is complex for anybody involved in the study of government. Recent media commentary suggests that ministers are increasingly detaching themselves, coming up with their own views about the way this process should be handled, which itself is interesting, and it's not unique to Brexit, of course. Just one final point. 80%, over 80% of employment in the UK is within the private sector. Many of the companies who are members of the CBI, as it were, contribute a significant proportion to that 80%, which means the capacity of business to represent its particular case on Brexit and on other issues such as taxation policy and public investment, the way it does that and represents itself to government is of concern to us all. Carolyn has recently been quoted in the media as warning about a disorderly crash landing if government assumes it can safely walk away from the Brexit talks. What we're going to hear about this evening from Carolyn and Rain is directly from CBI's representatives how the Confederation of British Industry and its representatives hope that that disorderly process does not end up in that disorderly way. Ladies and gentlemen, Carolyn, Rain.
Well, Tony, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here tonight at the LSE and joined by my colleague, Rain Newton-Smith, our Chief Economist. Thank you so much for inviting us, and thank you so much for your great air conditioning. Much appreciated. Now, for those of you who don't know the CBI, we speak for 190,000 firms of all sizes, from startups to entrepreneurs to large multinationals, in all parts of the country, from St Ives to Inverness, and employing over 7 million people. And this evening, we want to talk about Brexit from the grassroots perspective of these companies. Now, though it's a serious economics lecture, we are, after all, here at the LSE. Our aim is to use plain English about the impact of different Brexit outcomes on firms, people, and jobs. This is what we mean by eyes wide open. Now, as business, it is not our job to run the negotiations, but it is our job to be clear about the consequences. And although we're talking about the impact on companies, what this is really about is the future of jobs, growth, and prosperity in all parts of the UK. And frankly, it couldn't be more important. I've spent much of my last 4 weeks since the election visiting firms across the country, and to my mind, it is a time of really quite extraordinary opportunity. I do believe we have the chance to become a world leader in this next wave of technology revolution. And the reason for that is because it's all about creativity, innovation, science, ideas, the application of knowledge to manufacturing and services. And these are the UK's great strengths, in no small part, due to the excellence of our great universities like yours here at the LSE. Now, we are already excelling in the growing tech-based industries of the 21st century. We're creating thousands of high-quality jobs, both inside and outside London, and you see it everywhere you go. In the pioneering energy firms of the Tees Valley, the thriving digital cluster outside Cardiff in Wales, our very own Silicon Valley, in the fintech revolution taking place on the streets of Edinburgh and Glasgow, and in Belfast's burgeoning cybersecurity industry. These are just examples of what the UK's future could look like. The choices made round that EU negotiating table, if made well, could brighten this future. But if made badly, they could significantly dim it. So, tomorrow will be exactly 100 days since the UK triggered Article 50, and that means 630 days to go and counting. Now, businesses are watching. They're watching all over the world. They're making decisions right now, decisions about whether to make investments, where to site their headquarters, and ultimately whether to employ people. And of course, people are watching, and they too are making their decisions right now about whether to stay in the UK or apply for jobs here. And of course, universities are also making those decisions, from planning international research to hiring the best lecturers and attracting outstanding international students. Now, how we leave the EU, how we leave the European Union, could affect all of this. And to be absolutely clear, tonight's lecture is not about whether we leave the EU, it's all about how. Now, firms across the United Kingdom are committed to making a success of Brexit, but right now they are telling us that they are concerned about two things. First, Tony mentioned it, they're concerned about a no-deal outcome. The prospect that when the clock strikes midnight on March the 29th, 2019, time runs out and we leave without a deal. And second, that we may have the outline of a deal, but where's the transition to get there? What's the bridge to the new future which keeps things simple, that minimises disruption and maximises continuity? A transition period which lets us focus on what really matters, how we get the best new final relationship with the European Union. And tonight our proposal is that we need to build this bridge as soon as possible with our European partners. So our lecture this evening is in three parts. First, I will talk about why we need the smooth transition to a new deal. Rain will then talk about the economic impact of leaving without a deal. That's the real economics. I'm a very rusty one. And then I'll finish with some thoughts on what a smooth transition could look like, and crucially, the urgency and the spirit of mutual interest with which we need to approach it with our European partners. So let's start with trade. Now, trade really matters. It creates more choice, more innovation, lower prices, and ultimately higher standards of living. But of course, modern supply chains are inherently complex. Global companies operate across borders and are highly connected in a myriad of ways. Products are subject to regulations, standards, protections, guarantees, and trade agreements, which in turn involve a range of actors, courts, agencies, regulators, consumers and employees, often from across the globe. Complexity in trade is a fact of life. The more markets you deal with, the more rules diverge, the more complex it gets, and this can act as a brake on trade and a burden on business success. One set of rules for selling to France, a different set for Italy, and another completely different set for Ireland, and that is exactly how it used to be. But in the last 40 years, EU integration has cut through the complexity, making things simpler for business. The single market means one single set of rules for the whole EU, saving Europe's 23 million firms time and money, while the customs union lowers even further barriers to trade. Now, this can all feel pretty abstract and theoretical, so let me take 3 real-life products to illustrate what we're talking about, and crucially, what we need to think about when we're leaving. So I'm going to start with a simple loaf of bread. Let's take a factory located in County Antrim in Northern Ireland that delivers fresh loaves each day to both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. It gets its wheat from a supplier in the Republic, and as an importer, the baker needs to know that the wheat meets food safety standards on pesticides, for example. Now, these are monitored by agencies on both sides of the border, applying a common EU rulebook. As both the UK and the Republic of Ireland are in the single market and customs union, the wheat can be transported freely without any customs checks or import tariffs. This ensures the wheat arrives on time, and because it's perishable, that really matters. Now, bread, as we know, goes off, it gets stale. So all deliveries need to be on the road by 4 a.m. so the bread does arrive fresh. Again, EU standards smooth the way. Take the lorry that transports the wheat over the border and into the factory. That driver has a European driving licence, which has exactly the same criteria as every other member state. This combines with the European Community HGV licence, which registers the vehicle and harmonises the rules, which put a single limit on the number of hours the driver can do, allowing both driver and lorry to cross the border freely. Now, let's turn to our loaf of bread itself. The additives and preservatives which keep the bread fresh are defined by the EU, and they're used worldwide. To improve the bread's shelf life, the loaf is packaged. Under EU labelling laws, this packaging must list allergens and nutritional information, amongst other things, so customers know what they are eating. A single set of information which allows the bread to be stocked in both Belfast and Dublin with exactly the same label. So there you have it, something as everyday as a loaf of bread. EU rules essential for cutting through the complexity and making things simpler for business and cheaper and better for consumers. But of course, it's not just food. In cosmetics, some products cross the channel 5 times before they arrive in a shop. So let's take a lipstick sold in a pharmacy in Leeds. Now, a single lipstick, I didn't know this, but I've learnt it, can contain dozens of ingredients, waxes to help it keep its shape, oils and fats to give it the right texture, and of course, pigments for that all-important colour. Now, these ingredients are all regulated by a single set of European EU standards. Now, on top of this, the address of a legal representative, a responsible person, must be published on the lipstick's packaging. This person, who must be based in the EU, gives a product information file on the lipstick to the competent authority of the member state where the address is registered. The quality and efficiency and safety of the product information file means it's viewed as a gold standard across the world. But here's the best part. Only one file is needed to be able to sell this lipstick within the entire single market, again making things simple for business. This means today UK firms can with total ease access a European cosmetics market worth almost £70 billion. A final example, a car. Now, a car has been more talked about, but actually there's a lot going on in making a car. Today, if someone puts an order in for a new car, they can change things like the car's colour or whether it has a sunroof up to a week before delivery. Then the way it works is those different parts are gathered from suppliers across Europe, shipped to the UK through the Channel Tunnel, and they arrive on the factory floor at exactly the same time. It's just-in-time assembly. And any delay at all, means taking the vehicle out of the production line, which is disruptive, costly, and means the factory makes fewer cars per day. And automotive firms importing parts from Belgium and Germany allow only 15 minutes for delays. That's what just-in-time means. Now, thanks to the single market, they can import parts from all over Europe without worrying about customs checks slowing them down. EU trade arrangements also allow parts to be imported tariff-free from a range of third countries, from wing mirrors from South Africa to auto-electric technology from South Korea. The EU's global reach helps UK firms to thrive. And the benefits go beyond the nuts and bolts of the car itself. Increasingly, we're all buying cars on finance, on personal contract plans, and these often require a small deposit followed by a fixed monthly payment. Now, these, again, are underpinned by EU regulators, with passporting allowing financial service firms in one member state to offer services in another with no additional barriers. So the single market reduces cost and complexity and increases choice for consumers across the entire automotive supply. And of course, we must not forget what this means for the employees across the UK who work in these sectors. 300 bakery workers in the factory sites in County Antrim, 445 cosmetic SMEs in the UK who can grow and thrive. And the UK single market supports the automotive industry in the UK, which employs over 800,000 people, 78,000 young apprentices. So forgive the detail, but it's important. It's really important. These are just a few examples of where the EU has cut through complexity, creating a single, simple set of rules. So, of course, the $64,000 question is this. What happens if things change? And in particular, what happens if they change overnight? What might happen then? So, next, I'm going to hand over to Rain to look at the possible consequences of how we leave the EU, and in particular, of leaving without a deal.
Thank you, Carolyn. I'm Rain Newton-Smith. I'm the CBI's chief economist. And 18 years ago exactly, I sat in one of those chairs just up there, listening to macroeconomic lectures when I was studying for my master's here at LSE in economics. But tonight, and in the next 15 minutes, I want to look at what would happen if we didn't get a deal with the European Union. First, we need to understand a bit more about what we're good at, what we've gained in big picture terms by being part of the EU single market, and why a smooth transition is so important to all sectors of the economy. The EU encompasses the deepest trading arrangements in the world, covering more sectors and more areas of policy than WTO agreements alone, or any other trade deal around the world, as you can see by the dark red bits on the map, which surrounds the UK and the EU, just showing just the depth of our trading arrangement with the EU. For goods, EU integration has been a key driver of deeper and more complex European and global supply chains, especially in sectors like automotive, aviation, and chemicals. Over the last 16 years, the share of services in the UK's total trade has risen from 31 to 44%. The UK is really very good at exporting services. Such a high share is very unusual. In most developed countries, services exports tend to account for around 1/3 of total exports, whereas in the UK, it's closer to a half. And if we look at this chart, if we look at services now account for 40% of the UK's EU trade, which you can see by the increase in the light blue bars at the top. That's up from 23% back in 1999, which is actually the year I graduated from LSE. Compared with an increase of just over 6 percentage points for our non-EU trade in services, which is shown by the light orange bars near the bottom. Exports of business services such as design, advertising, and architecture, together with financial services, account for over half of the UK's overall growth in exports of services. But these sectors may be particularly vulnerable to a sudden re-emergence of trade barriers with the EU, or that no-deal scenario that we're concerned about. This chart looks at our competitive advantage in different sectors, and what it shows is that in most of the services industries, particularly financial services and other business services, our competitive strength is derived equally from our markets in the EU as they are from markets outside of the EU, which are shown by the dark blue bars. The light blue are the EU bars. Outside the EU, the UK is highly competitive in areas like insurance and pension services, as you can see by the dark blue bars. There are clearly big opportunities for the UK in exporting services around the world, tapping into the emerging middle class in Asia and other fast-growing trade routes. But regulatory barriers to trade are often much costlier for services than they are for manufacturing. So the harmonizations of rules that we've gained through the membership of the single market is particularly powerful for services. So wherever we end up in the long run in terms of our relationship with the EU, the UK needs to avoid a sudden change in rules that would prevent us from trading to our current strength in both goods and in services. We need a smooth transition to our new relationship to avoid disruption to our supply chains for businesses and for consumers. A no-deal scenario would be very costly for these businesses and consumers, and one of the most obvious costs would be tariffs. In a no-deal scenario, the UK would face tariffs on 90% of its EU goods exports by value. This chart shows estimates from some work that we've done on the potential costs on exports if UK-EU trade were carried out under WTO most favoured nation terms. Contrary to what it sounds like, most favoured nation terms are actually what you trade under if you don't have a preferential trading agreement in place. And what we found is, on average, the tariff across all goods sectors would be 4.3%. And if you applied this to our exports to the EU at the moment, that would be around 4.5 to 6 billion pounds per year. That's about 0.2 to 0.3% of GDP per year. But of course, this is a partial equilibrium analysis, as we economists like to say. I'm not here taking into account how the UK economy would respond, or indeed how the economy in the rest of the EU would respond. And nor does it show that average, what it would mean for particular goods. So for the car industry, what we've done is looked at the estimate for that industry. And what you need to do is take into account the inputs that come from outside of the EU, as well as those that come from the EU as part of that supply chain. And what we find is the estimate for the car industry range from 0.8 billion pounds a year to as much as 1.5 billion pounds per year for that industry. So there are serious consequences for the car industry of higher tariffs. And of course, some exports would face tariffs a lot higher than this average rate. So if we took meat, for instance, it would face a tariff of 26%. Of course, what some people have said is the UK's exchange rate has depreciated a lot over the past year, and surely that will offset some of the costs of these higher tariffs. Well, that's true, but only up to a point. I spend a lot of my time travelling up and down the country talking to businesses about how competitive they're feeling and what they're seeing in their supply chains. And when we look across our surveys, what we do find is, particularly in manufacturing, their sense of competitiveness against the EU market and the non-EU market are at a 22-year high in our latest survey back in June. But importantly, the argument also applies to higher input costs. And due to the weaker pound, our imports have also become much more expensive, with input costs rising at a double-digit pace in May. And we can see that impact across our surveys and across sectors, with price expectations being at very elevated levels. And of course, for consumers, higher prices for food and other goods means consumer price inflation is likely to peak above 3% this year. And at the same time, average pay growth isn't likely to keep pace. And so we're going to see this squeeze on household incomes. So I would say certainly for households, the weaker exchange rate doesn't feel like much of an offset or offer much salvation. And input costs would actually rise even further if we failed to negotiate a deal. Because so far I've talked about a tariff on exports, but actually we'd also face more tariffs on our imports. The government has said that it's seeking to adopt as its own the EU's World Trade Organization schedules on import tariffs and quotas. And copying and pasting those arrangements for our trading relationships with every other country as far as possible makes sense. It's a sensible step to the smooth transition that we want. But if we had no deal with the European Union, the UK would be obliged under WTO arrangements to impose the same tariffs on our imports from the EU as from other WTO members. And our estimates suggest that the average MFN tariff on the UK's imports from the EU would be around 5.7%. So that applying that to our imports, that would be an annual cost of between 11 and 13 billion pounds. So that's another 0.6 to 0.7% of GDP per year. Of course, businesses would have to choose how to deal with these costs, whether to take the hit themselves, which could affect their viability and competitiveness, or whether to pass these higher costs on to consumers. But I think one of the most important things to remember is actually, I think we focus too much on tariffs themselves. Higher tariffs are actually just the tip of the iceberg. The bit that we don't talk enough about are non-tariff barriers, which are also very important. Without a deal, the UK business would face new paperwork requirements, making trade more complicated and less efficient. And actually, it's likely, if we look at estimates out there across the academic literature, that this would have a bigger impact on competitiveness than any changes in tariffs, particularly for small countries. And in fact, we looked at a study that analysed the costs faced by US firms trading with the EU that could be eliminated through a trade agreement. And we borrowed from some work by other academics here at the LSE. And we estimate that if UK firms faced even half of those costs, it would be equivalent to an additional tariff of 6.5% on UK exports to the EU. And that's nearly double the most favoured nation tariff. So I think that's just to illustrate some of how important these non-tariff barriers are. And another way of looking at that is just to look at the sheer number of non-tariff barriers that we face in terms of our trade with the EU on goods. And this chart uses data from the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And what we see is across all sectors, there's around 405 different non-tariff barriers. The sectors that have the highest non-tariff barriers are in chemicals, agriculture, and machinery. So these non-tariff barriers, if we left the single market, would create big challenges for products like our lipstick and our loaf of bread. But I think it's important to remember that it isn't just the number of non-tariff barriers that matter, it's the type. So if we look at aerospace and defense, which looks rather lonely down there at the other end of the chart, which only has 9 non-tariff barriers. One of those requirements is the requirements for aircraft to be airworthy. And I think we'll all agree that complying with being airworthy is incredibly important and vital to ensure customer safety. So I think it's helpful to remember it's not just the number, it's what these regulations represent and what they mean for consumers, both here in the UK, but also across the rest of the EU. Another way of looking at or dividing up what all these barriers are is to think about economists divide them into at-the-border measures, and those include things like quotas, rules of origin, which help people distinguish where goods come from. And there are ways that we could use technology to try and address having more additional barriers. So we can use new IT systems to help with some of the logistical practicalities of moving things across borders and to help with the flow through some of those customs checks. And it is true that at the moment, businesses that are exporting outside of the EU or importing from outside of the EU at the moment from, say, the US or China are already conforming with some of these enhanced checks. But if we left the EU without a deal, the difference would be the sheer scale of the volume of our trade with the EU. And I think there really would be big questions over whether our ports and our airports would be able to deal with the changes in the high volumes of EU trade and the added logistics that we'd need. We'd see delays to some of that just-in-time production that Carolyn was mentioned in the car industry. And actually, in many facilities, at the moment, we just don't have the space to deal with those added customs. So when the lorries roll off the ferry at Dover, for example, they run straight into the White Cliffs of Dover, and there actually isn't much room for many more logistical checks. And equally, in Calais, we'd need more space within the EU to check that any goods coming from the UK satisfied EU customs checks. So there's a lot of logistical planning that needs to be done from both sides. And this solution will require serious negotiation, and it will require the UK and EU border forces to change how they do things. So I've talked about those at the border non-tariff barriers. There's also the measures that we call behind the borders, and really those are the harmonization of rules and common product standards that just make it easy for us to trade across borders. Carolyn has mentioned some of these earlier, so that's standardized packaging on our loaf of bread, for example. And at the moment, the responsibility for enforcing these rules rests with a combination of national bodies and 35 pan-European regulators and international courts. And at the moment, UK firms operate under these rules, whether they are producing for the domestic market or for export. But if we left without a deal, the responsibility for making sure that UK exports comply with EU rules would shift from UK regulators to those EU customs officials. And this loss of control could mean that UK exports to the EU could be held at the border until it was clear they complied with EU rules. And going back to Carolyn's lipstick example, in the no-deal scenario, without that mutual recognition, the responsible person would need to move to another member state if they are based in the UK. So meaning the address on the packaging would need to be changed, which could mean that that small business would be forced to have two production lines, one for lipsticks that go to the EU and one for UK lipsticks, which might not be there at present. So there's lots of logistics for businesses themselves to think through. But on regulation, the repeal bill that's being tabled in the UK is part of the answer, but it's not the whole answer. While this bill will enshrine EU regulations into UK law, it just can't offer the reciprocal recognition that we need to see across the rest of the EU. Nor will it deal with the process of UK and EU regulations diverging in the future and moving potentially in different directions. And beyond tariffs, which you hear a lot about, and non-tariff barriers, which I've said we don't hear enough about, there's another economic consequence of no deal I want to mention. Without a comprehensive deal with the EU, some companies may not be able to do any business at all. And this is the very cliff edge that we want to avoid. We don't want to get up close to this cliff edge. Services industries, in particular, would not be able to rely on WTO rules alone. And let's not forget, services account for over 80% of the UK economy. An agreement governing UK and EU airspace, for example, would be needed to keep planes flying to the continent. An agreement recognizing those driver's license for those lorries would also be needed so that a driver in the UK could drive seamlessly across to the EU, as Carolyn was mentioning in her bread example. And of course, an agreement allowing financial services to continue operating under passporting arrangements would also be needed, so that banks based here would be able to offer financial services across the rest of the EU. Without this, firms wouldn't be able to carry out some of the activities that are regulated under passporting, and we know that that activity is so important for our whole economy. If we look at research by Oliver Wyman, this suggests that passporting directly accounts for between 7 and 10% of value added in financial services. And spillovers to other activities could lead to a loss of a further 7% of value added. And if we look across the other range of business and professional services, some sectors could lose their legal basis to conduct business in the EU. So broadcasting, postal services, and other range of business and professional services could be affected. So if you take the legal sector, for example, JP Morgan highlights that in 5 EU member states, if you don't have EU nationality or admission to a bar in an EU member state, you're just not allowed to provide legal advice. So leaving without a deal could mean that UK law firms lose out to companies on the continent, putting a question mark over the UK's position as a European hub for global law firms. And this is what that cliff edge looks like up close. And I think we can all agree we don't really want to get close to it. And so it is also important that we look beyond the EU. And many have spoken about the benefits of new trading opportunities from being outside the customs union. So I want to talk a little bit about that. I'm well aware of this wider world as a former head of emerging markets with a keen interest in China's growth. But it's important to remember that through our EU membership, the UK has free trade deals with a broad range of countries. So if we look at this chart, the range of trade deals that we have through our partnership with the EU covers countries such as South Korea. And if we take them all together, that represents over 60% of our total trade at the moment. So, and if we look outside of the EU, we see that 20% of our trade goes to the US, with another 20% going to countries outside of the US. So if we are looking outside of the EU and looking to sign new trade agreements, it's clear that the US is an immediate priority in terms of scale. But let's be honest, I think any trade deal with the US certainly feels a long way away at the moment. But I think looking further ahead, it's important to understand where our biggest export markets are likely to be. And if we look to Oxford Economics, our biggest market for goods is still likely to be the EU in 2026, assuming a smooth Brexit scenario. And so even though our trade to fast-growing emerging markets over the next 10 years is set to double, so you can see that from China and India, where the overall level of trade is set to double over the next decade. And in the EU still holds the greatest potential in terms of goods. And you can see that just by the sheer scale of where we start from with the EU and where we're likely to end up. And in services, according to Oxford Economics, from 2021 to 2030, the UK services exports to India, China, and Indonesia will grow by over 10% on average per year. So that is quite a stellar performance. But even then, the services exports to these countries in 2030 would still be worth less than a third of the value of our EU exports today. So I think this is just trying to underline how important it is that we get the right deal with the EU and a smooth transition to that deal. And now I'm going to pass you back to Carolyn for the final part of tonight's lecture.
Thank you very much indeed, Rain. And I think it is pretty clear that there would be real cost to our economy of leaving the EU without a deal. And as Tony said at the beginning, I think crash landing just about sums it up. But let's stop in this final third of our lecture and stop for a moment to reflect on our goal as a country in these negotiations, on where we want to be when this is all over. We are looking for an agreement which builds on 4 decades of painstaking economic integration. We're seeking the most ambitious and comprehensive free trade deal ever agreed in history, and we're pushing for a deal which works for business, a deal which does make sure that bakers in Northern Ireland can sell their bread to Dublin without delay, where cosmetics firms can work under one set of standards across Europe, where car manufacturers can continue to bring in parts from all over the EU without red tape. Now that's the true scale of the challenge, and I do believe that we can rise to it. Business is wholeheartedly committed to making Brexit a success. And the new EU Exit Business Advisory Group, that's a bit of a mouthful, but it's a good thing, set up by ministers, is the first step towards a deeper partnership. A place where business and government can use evidence and experience to solve problems and put the economy first. The goal should be a framework for the new trading relationship before we exit in March 2019. To use the language of business, we call it a heads of agreement in writing that would allow technical talks to start and allow companies to plan with greater clarity. Yet, even with the greatest possible goodwill on both sides, given the complexity we would face, it's pretty well impossible to imagine the detail will be clear by the end of March 2019. This is a time to be realistic. So, instead of a cliff edge, the UK needs a bridge to the new EU deal. And our proposal is that the UK should seek to stay in the single market and a customs union until a final deal is in force. This would create a bridge to the new trading arrangement that for businesses would feel a lot like the road they are on, because making two transitions from where they are now to a staging post and then again to a final deal would be wasteful, difficult, and uncertain in itself. One transition is better than two, and certainty is better than uncertainty. And firms tell us this feels like common sense. But if others have alternatives that deliver equivalent economic benefits, now is the time to put them on the table. If agreed soon, firms here and from elsewhere in the European Union will know they face greater stability for a number of years and will carry on investing. They will know they don't have to adapt twice. In practice, what does it mean in practice? It would mean that the UK would adhere to the EU's common trade policy for both internal and external trade for the duration of the transition period. And staying in the single market guarantees continuity for business operations. Staying in a customs union guarantees ease of trade, not just with the EU, but with the rest of the world as well. And making the choice to stay in the single market for the transition would also mean continuing to apply the rules of the single market. So ways would have to be found to continue influencing those rules as they evolve. But crucially, it would also mean that the British Parliament and the devolved governments could have the time they need to get domestic legislation right, implementing decisions after they've been made in negotiation instead of trying to legislate for every possibility, which is very, very hard. Now, this would free up time to focus on domestic priorities and create breathing room to get the final deal right. Making the choice to stay in the customs union for the transition would also mean continuing to apply the same tariffs on goods from the rest of the world. And what is true is that the UK's room to sign new free trade agreements could be limited for a time. But the very important work of deepening trade ties with global markets could continue, as it does today, with officials and businesses already hard at work in several markets, including the US and China. And our Department for International Trade could have the time they need to prepare for the task of plotting our new global economic future. Now, the exact mechanisms to achieve this can be debated and negotiated. But for businesses trying to make decisions, this is the simplest answer to the uncertainty they face today. But let me repeat one thing. This is not about whether we are leaving the European Union. Once that Article 50 clock strikes midnight on the 29th of March 2019, the UK will leave the EU. The UK will be independent politically and no longer represented in the European Council. We will no longer have members of the European Parliament, and to the eyes of every global actor, we will be on our way. So this is not about whether we leave, but how. This common sense approach would bring continuity to firms in the UK and the EU and protect investment today. So we need to build this bridge to the new future, and with our European partners, we need to build it now. A final word, if I may, on urgency. This agreement on the transition is needed fast. Waiting until March 2019 is simply too late. And we know this because firms tell us. The prospect of these multiple cliff edges in tariffs, red tape, and regulation is already casting a long shadow over business decisions. The result is a drip of investment, silently taken, decisions taken, deferred, or lost. A major European engineering and electronics firm has told us it has shelved plans to build a UK innovation centre. A UK infrastructure provider is already having problems retaining and recruiting skilled people from the EU needed to build the rails, roads and houses already planned. And we've heard that some firms in the chemical sector are assuming WTO tariffs in business cases for new investment and adjusting future plans accordingly. There will be a time when the threat of no deal starts to affect decisions in an even more serious way. Every sector and every company will have a different tipping point, a different timescale depending on how they do business. So for the bakery I mentioned earlier, if they decide they do need to shift production into the Republic of Ireland, they probably need about 20 months to set that up. So if 20 months before Brexit Day, they feel the risk of no deal is too high, the balance will tip and they'll have to start that move. So that could mean next month. For the automotive firm I mentioned, it's likely to be the lead-in time for their order books, which tips the scales. Now, these are filled about 18 months in advance. So if 18 months before Brexit Day, they don't know whether they'll be facing tariffs or if they'll be able to provide finance, they won't know how to price their cars. So their tipping point could be this autumn. Similarly, airlines will soon start selling tickets for flights in summer 2019, and without actions from negotiators, they'll be doing so without any clarity on whether flights between the UK and the EU will have a sound legal basis. And then again, the cosmetics firm from Leeds I mentioned earlier might just be too small to have contingency plans at all. With a tiny head office, no bandwidth to weigh up the likelihood of each scenario. So if 6 months from Brexit Day things are no clearer, they might not make that next investment or hire those new apprentices. So how this bridge to the future is built is a conversation we need urgently with our European partners. It should happen in a spirit of mutual interest and be a priority for both sides. Now, the UK should make the proposal, the simple and common sense proposal of staying in the single market and a customs union until a final deal is implemented. We should make it on the basis of benefit to firms and prosperity across the continent of Europe. Everyone, I believe, has this goal at heart, and we urge Brussels to agree. Breaking from its mantra that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed for the good of the European economy. Business can and will adapt to new circumstances, but it can't suddenly change overnight without any warning. Politicians might think in weeks, but business plans in years. So to conclude this evening, our lecture this evening has focused on the complexity of trade and how the EU has helped to cut through it. In recent decades, the single market and customs union have made life simpler for UK firms and as a result increased jobs and investment. And as we negotiate a new relationship with the EU, we should not underestimate the risks of reversing this. Leaving without a deal would pull the rug out from under many firms' feet. It would mean more complexity, a return not just to tariffs but also to non-tariff barriers. And in some service sectors, it could stop firms doing business. We need to take the right action right now. We need transitional arrangements. Instead of a cliff edge, we need a bridge to our new future. So instead of adding more complexity, let's do something really simple. In the absence of a better alternative, let's aim explicitly to stay in the single market and a customs union until a final deal is agreed. This would give government time to negotiate the deal we need, and it would give business the certainty to keep on creating the prosperity we need. This is a time for keeping our eyes wide open, keeping them focused on the benefits of what we have and the costs of losing it, and the opportunity to get things right for communities, for young people, for jobs and prosperity everywhere in the UK and for generations to come. It is a time for common sense. Thank you very much.